Rich woman heard her driver speaking 9 different languages, immediately called him learn. The secret. Margaret Collins was the kind of woman whose name echoed through the boardrooms of Manhattan. Owner of one of the largest technology empires in the United States, her life was a whirlwind of mergers, acquisitions, investor meetings, and technological breakthroughs. To the public, she was a symbol of determination and success. To her competitors, she was a force of nature, and to those who worked for her, she was a boss who demanded excellence, precision, and absolute discretion. Her life was meticulously structured. Every morning, exactly at 7 o'clock, her driver waited for her outside the towering glass building where she resided on Fifth Avenue. Her routine never faltered. Margaret was a woman who trusted data, processes, and predictability. Surprises, in her world, were risks, and she had spent her entire life minimizing them. Her driver, David Ramirez, had been in her employment for a little over 2 years. A man in his mid-40s, he was always impeccably dressed in a sharp black suit, his shoes polished to perfection, his dark hair neatly combed, and his posture straight as if molded by discipline. David was the embodiment of professionalism. He spoke only when spoken to, always maintained a courteous tone, and never overstepped the invisible boundaries that Margaret set with all her employees. In truth, Margaret had never given much thought to David beyond the functions he performed. He was reliable, punctual, and discreet, qualities she valued immensely but never pondered further. She knew the basics from the brief provided by Human Resources, American, born in Chicago, with an unremarkable employment history in private transportation. No red flags, no complications. That particular Thursday morning began like any other. David pulled up the sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class exactly at 7 o'clock, stepping out to open the door for her. She slid into the back seat with her usual efficiency, immediately diving into her tablet, reviewing the financial reports for the quarterly board meeting scheduled for later that day. "Good morning, Ms. Collins." David greeted her, his tone calm, polished, professional. "Morning, David." She replied automatically, barely lifting her eyes from the screen. The ride was smooth, as always. Manhattan's traffic was dense but predictable at that hour, and David had a knack for finding the most efficient routes. As the car glided down Park Avenue, Margaret remained engrossed in her spreadsheets, oblivious to the world outside the tinted windows. But something shifted. At the corner of 42nd Street, David pulled slightly toward the curb to avoid a construction zone. As he did, an Uber Eats cyclist knocked on the passenger side window, gesturing nervously. From the reflection in her tablet, Margaret noticed David lowering the window just slightly. "Excusez-moi, monsieur, pouvez-vous m'aider? Je suis complètement perdu," the cyclist asked hurriedly in French. Without hesitation, David responded in fluent, polished French, his tone patient yet confident. "Bien sûr, vous êtes à 3 pâtés de maisons de la 5e avenue. Prenez cette rue à droite, puis continuez tout droit. Vous y arriverez en 5 minutes." The conversation lasted no more than 30 seconds. David offered a small nod, rolled the window back up, and continued driving as if nothing had happened. Margaret's eyes lifted from her tablet, confusion momentarily pushing aside her corporate focus. French? Did he just speak French? Perfectly. She blinked, processing the moment, but forced herself back into the numbers on her screen. Perhaps she had misheard. Maybe he had memorized a phrase or two. Barely 10 minutes passed before another strange event unfolded. As they approached Grand Central, a visibly distressed tourist flagged them down at a crosswalk, waving a printed map. David, again lowering the window, leaned slightly toward the man. Entschuldigung, können Sie mir helfen? Ich suche die U-Bahn Station. The man asked in German. Natürlich. David answered smoothly. U-Bahn Station ist dort. Sie gehen geradeaus, dann links in der Ampel. Die. Margaret's fingers froze on the tablet. This was not a memorized phrase. This was fluent, effortless German. She stared forward, her mind shifting from financial forecasts to the oddity unfolding in her presence. As the car resumed its course, she found herself studying David through the rearview mirror, her analytical mind firing questions as if evaluating a new business acquisition. Who was this man? Really? Was he European? No, his file clearly stated he was born and raised in Chicago. Had he spent years abroad? No mention of that either. None of it made sense. Despite her growing curiosity, Margaret said nothing. For a woman who thrived on information, her instinct told her to observe first. Confrontation or questioning could come later. For now, she simply watched, her sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decode an unexpected algorithm suddenly dropped into her perfectly structured life. The remainder of the ride continued in silence, but it was a silence charged with questions. As they pulled into the underground garage of her corporate headquarters, David stepped out and opened the door as usual. "Have a good day, Miss Collins," he said, his tone no different than any other day. "You too, David," she replied, but this time her gaze lingered on him a moment longer. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Margaret's heart wasn't pounding over the numbers on her reports anymore. Instead, it raced with something far more unusual for her highly controlled existence: curiosity. Something about David Ramirez did not add up. And Margaret Collins was not a woman who left mysteries unsolved. The following day unfolded with Margaret feeling a level of distraction she was entirely unaccustomed to. For someone whose mind operated like a high-speed processor, who thrived on clarity, control, and solutions, it was jarring to find herself pondering something entirely outside the confines of her company's balance sheets. The images from the day before replayed with stubborn persistence, David speaking flawless French, then switching to impeccable German as easily as flipping a switch. It gnawed at her, refusing to be dismissed. When the morning arrived, she followed her routine as always, stepping into the back of the same black Mercedes-Benz. David greeted her with his usual nod and neutral tone. Nothing in his manner suggested anything had changed. He was as composed and professional as ever. His hands steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. But now, Margaret was not merely a passenger. She was an observer. Every movement, every word, every interaction became part of an evolving puzzle her mind was determined to solve. As they turned onto Lexington Avenue, an elderly woman approached the car while they waited at a red light. Her gestures were frantic, pointing at her phone, her expression one of confusion and slight desperation. David lowered the window just enough to hear her. "Perdón, señor, ¿sabe cómo llegar a la estación de metro más cercana?" the woman asked in Spanish. Without a pause, David's voice softened, answering in perfect Spanish. "Cuadras y luego girar a la izquierda. La estación está justo allí." "Claro, siga recto dos." Margaret blinked. Spanish. Flawless, unaccented Spanish. Not a word stumbled, not a pause. For translation. It rolled out of him as naturally as breathing. The woman smiled, thanked him profusely, and walked away, leaving Margaret stunned in her seat. She pressed her lips together, folding her hands over her lap, staring at the back of David's head as if it might open and offer some schematic explaining how this was possible. She decided then that observation was no longer enough. Subtlety would have to become her new tool. Leaning forward slightly, she spoke in a tone casual enough to sound incidental. "I didn't know you spoke Spanish." David's eyes flickered briefly in the rearview mirror. "A little, ma'am. Enough to help sometimes." Margaret raised an eyebrow. That didn't sound like "a little." That sounded fluent. He offered a modest shrug, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the same composed steadiness. "I grew up around it. You pick things up." She narrowed her eyes. That was the most dismissive, vague response possible. Useful in deflecting curiosity, perhaps, but utterly insufficient for someone like Margaret, who made her fortune dissecting vague answers into precise truths. The day continued with her agenda packed as always, meetings with investors, product development reviews, and a working lunch with the legal team. But even as she negotiated contract clauses or evaluated prototype demonstrations, a corner of her mind remained hooked on the earlier exchange. Her chance to press further arrived later that afternoon. On the drive back to her residence, as they crossed Madison, the car slowed to navigate a delivery truck partially blocking the lane. A man standing by the curb, clearly struggling with his phone's GPS, waved at the car. He gestured in frustration, then spoke in hurried Mandarin, asking for directions. Margaret's eyes widened. She braced herself. David responded in fluid Mandarin, his pronunciation crisp, his tone casual, as if he had spent years immersed in Beijing's crowded streets or Shanghai's busy marketplaces. The conversation was brief but undeniably real, precise instructions, a polite farewell, and then the window rolled back up. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret was no longer just curious. She was astounded. She waited a moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully. Her tone laced with disbelief. "Quite the talent for languages, David." "Mandarin too?" she said. His response was measured, almost rehearsed. "It comes in handy sometimes." Margaret leaned back, folding her arms. "I imagine it does." The rest of the drive unfolded in tense quiet, filled with Margaret's racing thoughts. She had encountered multilingual individuals before, in international meetings, among executives who had spent years living abroad, in foreign diplomats. But none of them had displayed the kind of seamless, fluid ability David demonstrated. This was not someone who had studied a language casually in school or memorized tourist phrases. This was mastery, and not of just one language, but several. And the most confounding part was that nothing in his employment file, nor anything in the brief interviews when he was hired, indicated such a skill set. When the car pulled up to her building, David did as he always did, stepping out, opening the rear passenger door, and offering a polite "Have a good evening, ma'am." Margaret stepped out, pausing for a brief moment beside him. Her eyes scanned him carefully, as if searching for any visible clue, some crack in the facade. "Thank you, David," she said, her voice even but carrying a new weight beneath its surface. "I suspect we'll be seeing a bit more of each other over the next few days." David nodded, unfazed. "Of course, ma'am. Just let me know where and when." As the door to the lobby closed behind her, Margaret's mind was already formulating a plan. She was a strategist, after all. Problems were simply puzzles waiting to be solved, and puzzles were what she excelled at. That night, seated in the quiet solitude of her penthouse, she reviewed his personnel file again. She scrolled through the digital documents on her secure tablet, employment history, background check, references. It was all meticulously ordinary. Born in Chicago. Attended public school. Worked various jobs before transitioning into private driving services. No international travel, no academic accolades in linguistics, no military service that might explain language acquisition. She pulled up an old photo attached to the file, David, standing beside a previous employer's vehicle, smiling faintly, no different than any other professional chauffeur. And yet, the man in that photo now felt like a locked vault of secrets, and she was holding no key. Margaret tapped her nails against the glass table, staring at the city skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her curiosity had evolved into obsession. She could not, would not let this go. Tomorrow, she decided, the questions would stop being subtle. Tomorrow, she would push. The morning dawned crisp and cool, the sun barely breaking through the dense grid of Manhattan's towering skyline. Margaret Collins sat in the back of her car with a determined expression, her fingers tapping impatiently against her leather briefcase. She had decided that today she would no longer allow the mystery surrounding David Ramirez to linger unresolved. The data-driven executive in her demanded clarity. Patterns. Answers. And this, whatever it was, had become an anomaly that disrupted her otherwise perfectly predictable universe. As the car weaved through the midtown traffic, Margaret purposely arranged her schedule to include multiple stops around the city, stops that were not strictly necessary for her business, but carefully chosen to increase the chances of observing David's interactions. If yesterday had been surprising, today would be the day she gathered more data, more proof of what her instincts told her was no coincidence. Her first stop was a charity event hosted at a boutique hotel in Soho. As David pulled up to the valet, Margaret exited the vehicle but deliberately lingered near the sidewalk, pretending to adjust her scarf. A man approached David holding a package and a clipboard, visibly confused and mumbling while gesturing toward the building. "Scusi, signore, sto cercando l'entrata principale. Questo è il lato giusto?" The man asked in Italian. David turned his head toward him and responded without missing a beat, his voice fluid, comforting, and natural. "Sì, è proprio che segua questo marciapiede fino all'angolo e trova l'ingresso sulla sinistra." The man nodded gratefully, thanking him before disappearing toward the corner. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. Italian added to the growing list. Her mind began constructing an internal spreadsheet, cataloging each language with the same precision she used when reviewing quarterly earnings. French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, and now Italian. Throughout the charity luncheon, her attention drifted frequently from the speakers at the podium back to the enigma waiting outside in her car. The moment it concluded, she left promptly, resuming her subtle investigation. Her next destination was a corporate meeting at a luxury co-working space in the Flatiron district. As David waited by the vehicle, a group of delivery workers argued loudly over a misplaced shipment. One of the younger men broke off from the group and approached the car, speaking rapidly. "Maaf, bol bantu saya. Saya tidak bisa menemukan alamat ini." The man asked in Bahasa Indonesia, pointing at his phone. Margaret felt her breath catch. Surely not. David leaned slightly out of the window, his voice calm but authoritative. "Tentu saja. Gedung itu. Dua blok ke timur, lalu belok kiri di lampu lalu lintas. Anda akan menemukannya di sisi kanan. Jalan." The delivery worker bowed slightly in thanks, scurried back to his colleagues, and the commotion faded into the background. Margaret sat frozen, processing what she had just witnessed. Her logical mind strained against the sheer improbability of it. This was no accident. No simple hobby. No passive skill acquired through casual exposure. This was mastery, layer upon layer of it. Her phone vibrated with incoming emails, messages from board members, reminders about pending decisions. For the first time in years, she ignored them entirely. The ride to her next stop, an impromptu visit to a supplier in Chinatown, presented yet another unexpected situation. As they paused at an intersection, an elderly man tapped on the passenger window. David lowered it without hesitation. The man asked in Mandarin, his voice frail but urgent. David responded instantly, his tone shifting seamlessly into the gentle, respectful cadence appropriate for speaking to someone of the man's age. Margaret's eyes narrowed. It was not simply that he could speak these languages, it was that he adapted to each speaker with cultural precision, modifying his tone, inflection, and body language as if slipping into a different identity each time. The rest of the day continued like a parade of linguistic encounters. Outside a Middle Eastern restaurant where she had arranged a working dinner, David exchanged words in Arabic with a confused food delivery driver who could not locate the correct address. The driver asked in frustration. David leaned toward him, answering in calm, precise Arabic. Margaret's breath hitched yet again. Arabic. His tone flawless, his delivery smooth. No hesitation. No searching for words. He was not translating in his head. He was thinking in it. The dinner itself was a blur. Margaret could hardly focus on the supplier's pitch, on discussions of logistics, or on price negotiations. Her mind was far too busy spinning scenarios, parsing probabilities, and discarding each as too implausible. There was no plausible explanation within the confines of his employment history, education background, or personal file that could justify what she was observing. As they finally pulled away from the restaurant, the evening air crisp against the window, Margaret broke the long silence. Her voice was sharper this time, less veiled in casual curiosity, and more edged with the commanding tone that had turned her into a corporate titan. David, she said, her gaze fixed on the back of his head. Speak. How many languages do you actually? There was a pause. For the first time since she had met him, David did not respond immediately. His grip on the steering wheel tightened imperceptibly. When he did speak, his voice was lower, measured, as though selecting each word carefully from a shelf of potential responses. Enough to get by, he answered. Margaret scoffed lightly, not bothering to hide the disbelief in her tone. French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, Italian, Baisa, Arabic. And that's just today. That's not an answer. Enough to get by is a gross understatement. David remained silent, eyes forward, posture rigid. You've worked for me for 2 years. She continued, her voice quieter now but no less intense. And somehow this has never come up. Never once in your file. Never mentioned. How exactly does a private driver come to speak, what is it now, 7, 8 languages fluently? The silence stretched. Only the hum of the engine and the distant sounds of city traffic filled the space between them. When David finally spoke, his voice was softer, tinged with something Margaret could not quite place. Regret? Caution? Weariness? It is not something I usually talk about, he said. Well, she replied, leaning forward slightly. You are going to. David sighed, pulling the car smoothly onto her street. As the vehicle slowed to a stop outside her building, he placed it in park but did not immediately move to open her door as he always did. Instead, he remained seated, hands resting on the wheel. "There are things about me that do not belong on paper," he said finally, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Margaret met his gaze, her piercing blue eyes unwavering. "Then tomorrow," she said, her tone brokering no room for negotiation. "We are going to have a very long conversation." David gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, ma'am." Neither of them said another word as she stepped out of the car, but the air between them was charged, heavy with the weight of truths waiting to be unearthed. Margaret walked toward her building, her heels striking the pavement with more force than usual, her mind already racing toward whatever answers tomorrow might bring. The next morning arrived beneath heavy clouds, the sky over Manhattan painted in shades of gray, as if nature itself anticipated the weight of the conversation to come. Margaret Collins stood by the grand floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse, arms crossed, watching the city slowly awaken. Her coffee sat untouched on the marble countertop behind her, growing cold as her thoughts spiraled into the inevitable confrontation ahead. At precisely 7 o'clock, as always, David Ramirez pulled the black Mercedes-Benz to the curb. His punctuality was as flawless as his discretion. Yet today, Margaret noticed a subtle tension in the way he stepped out to open her door. His shoulders were stiffer, his movements slightly less fluid, as if his usual armor of professionalism was strained under the pressure of what both of them knew would happen. "Good morning, Miss Collins," he greeted with his customary politeness, though his voice carried a weight absent on previous days. "Morning, David," she replied, sliding into the back seat, her tone clipped, eyes sharp. As the car pulled smoothly into traffic, the familiar hum of the city filled the silence, the distant wail of sirens, the rhythmic chatter of crosswalk signals, the rumble of delivery trucks. But inside the vehicle, an unnatural quiet pressed between them, thick and expectant. Margaret wasted no time. "I trust you remember the conversation we ended with yesterday." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed forward. "Yes, ma'am," he said, after a pause. "Good," she replied. "Because today I expect actual answers." For a few moments, it seemed as though he might attempt to deflect, to retreat behind the polite walls that had served him so well. But then, with a long breath that seemed to carry years of withheld truths, David nodded slightly. "I figured this day might come," he said quietly. Margaret tilted her head, folding her arms, her expression unreadable but relentless. "Then let's stop pretending. I want to know how a man with no formal linguistic background, no military service, no time abroad, speaks 8 languages fluently as if he were born to each of them." David's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror, meeting hers. For the first time since they had known each other, his carefully constructed mask showed the faintest fracture. "It is not something I generally discuss," he said finally. Margaret leaned forward, her voice edged with the authority that had closed billion-dollar deals and crushed competitors in boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. "Well, today you are going to discuss it." David remained silent for several heartbeats, as if weighing whether the cost of disclosure outweighed the safety of continued silence. Finally, he exhaled. "I grew up in a neighborhood in Chicago that was unlike most others." He began slowly, his tone distant, as though drawing memories from a place long buried. "My block was a patchwork of the world. Families from everywhere, Mexico, China, Italy, Lebanon, India, Russia. It was not just diverse. It was survival. If you could not communicate, you could not connect. If you could not connect, you were isolated. Vulnerable. Margaret listened, her sharp eyes watching every nuance, every subtle shift in his voice and body language. I was a quiet kid. David continued, his hands steady on the wheel but his gaze softer now. I listened. More than most. I watched the way people struggled. Watched how a simple misunderstanding could cause fights, fear, or even someone getting hurt. And I do not know why, but words stuck with me. Sounds, rhythms, patterns. I would listen to old men argue in Russian at the corner store, and by the time I was 10, I understood what they were saying. But Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. You mean to tell me you just absorbed it? David let out a faint, humorless chuckle. Not exactly. I spent time with them. I sat with the old Chinese couple who ran the laundromat. Helped them carry supplies, and they taught me phrases. Same with the Lebanese grocer. Same with the Italian baker. It was not about studying. It was necessity. Curiosity. Maybe both. And nobody noticed. Margaret pressed, skeptical but undeniably intrigued. Oh, they noticed. David said with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. At first, they thought it was cute. A kid picking up a few words. But as time went on, they realized it was more than that. By the time I was 14, I could mediate arguments between families. Help someone translate a medical form. Explain legal notices. Adults started calling me before they called anyone else. Margaret absorbed this, but it did not satisfy the full scope of her curiosity. That explains how you started. It does not explain how you became this. What I saw yesterday was not basic conversation. It was fluency. Precision. You adapted to formal, informal, cultural nuances like someone who had lived a lifetime in those languages. David was quiet for a long stretch of road. The car glided past Central Park, the trees a blur of early autumn color. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time, as though each word carried a weight he was reluctant to bear. There was more to it. He admitted. When I was 17, my sister got sick. Really sick. My parents could not navigate the hospital systems, the insurance paperwork. Most of the doctors did not speak Spanish well enough to help. I had to do it. I translated everything. Every form. Every diagnosis, every conversation. But it was not just for us. Other families in the waiting rooms were in the same boat. Some spoke Hindi. Others spoke Arabic or Russian. I started helping them too. His voice tightened, memory clearly tugging at something deep. It became my job. Not paid. Not official. But necessary. Because no one else would. I spent hours at the hospitals, at the clinics, learning medical terms, legal jargon. It was not a hobby anymore. It was survival. For my family. For everyone like us. Margaret's fingers drummed silently against her thigh. Her analytical brain parsed this with growing respect, though her expression remained composed. So that is how you became fluent. Out of necessity. David nodded, his jaw set. That is part of it. Only part, she asked, her tone pointed. He hesitated again. Yes. There were other reasons. But I do not usually talk about them. Margaret did not push further yet. Not today. But she recognized the signal, a door cracked. Open, not wide, but no longer fully closed. For someone as private as David, this was monumental. As they pulled up to her next destination, David stepped out and opened the door for her as usual. But their eyes met differently this time, no longer merely employer and employee. There was something else now. A shift in the fabric of their relationship. A recognition that beneath the surface of mundane roles were lives filled with unseen histories, unspoken sacrifices, and extraordinary capacities. Margaret stepped onto the sidewalk, pausing before heading into her meeting. Her voice softened, but it carried the undeniable tone of someone not yet finished with her quest for truth. "This conversation is not over, David." His response was quiet, steady. "I know, ma'am." Margaret Collins was not a woman accustomed to leaving questions unanswered. For years, her ability to untangle the most complex financial webs and decode the opaque motives of corporate rivals had become her defining trait. She was relentless, methodical, and precise. And now, the mystery that sat in the driver's seat of her own car had become an intellectual challenge unlike any she had faced before. The story David offered was compelling, poignant, even, but it was also incomplete. She could feel it in the way his words paused at certain edges, how his eyes deflected at critical moments. There was more. Much more. The moment her morning meeting concluded, she cancelled her next 2 appointments. Something she had not done in years. She retreated to her office, a sleek space lined with glass and steel, overlooking the chaos of Manhattan like a queen surveying her kingdom. Her assistant knocked to deliver a stack of reports, but Margaret waved her off. Numbers could wait. This could not. She opened her private laptop, bypassing the corporate firewall and logging into a series of personal databases she maintained for sensitive research. While the company's formal security systems were impressive, Margaret's private systems were something else entirely, built by a team of cybersecurity experts she had quietly retained for occasions when information required digging beyond the surface. Typing David Ramirez into the search yielded the same baseline results. Born in Chicago. Public school education. No college listed. Employment history clean but ordinary, various service jobs, a stint at a delivery company, then a long period in private driving. No criminal records, no financial red flags, no anomalies that would alert a background check. But Margaret was not searching for what was visible. She was looking for what was conspicuously absent. Diving deeper, she traced his early life. His neighborhood was exactly as he described, a multicultural enclave riddled with waves of immigration over the decades. Census data confirmed the diversity, matching his claims about growing up around Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Italian, and Russian speakers. That part held. But it was the gap between the ages of 19 and 24 that drew her attention. 5 years with no documented employment, no tax records, no medical records, not even a utility bill. For someone as meticulous as Margaret, gaps were never accidents. Gaps were where secrets lived. She cross-referenced city permits, court filings, and even obscure community bulletins. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling threads one after the other. And then, something. A brief mention in an archived article from a small, now-defunct local newspaper. The piece was about a community initiative aimed at helping immigrant families navigate the healthcare system. Buried in the text was a single sentence: David Ramirez, a local volunteer known for assisting families with translation services in over half a dozen languages, was present during the opening ceremony. It was a minor mention, a blink-and-miss detail, but to Margaret, it was a signal flare. This was not a casual hobby. He had been recognized in his own community for it, albeit quietly. Pushing further, she discovered an old grant application filed by a neighborhood nonprofit. In it, David's name appeared under Community Contributors. With a handwritten note, Special. Thanks for providing emergency translation in critical cases. No further details, but the consistency was there. The deeper she looked, the clearer a pattern emerged, not in official records but in the absence of them. He left almost no digital footprint. No social media. No professional networking profiles. No traceable online presence beyond the minimal data collected by public systems. In an era when even the most private individuals left breadcrumbs online, David was a ghost. That in itself was telling. Margaret sat back, fingers steepled beneath her chin, her eyes narrowing. Either David was an extraordinarily private man, something increasingly rare, or he had purposefully erased his trail. Both scenarios raised the stakes of her curiosity. Her mind ticked through the possibilities. Was he running from something? Hiding from someone? Or was he simply someone who had learned early that invisibility was a kind of power? Whatever the answer, Margaret was not someone who accepted ambiguity. Determined to get first-hand information, she decided on a new approach. This time, it would not be passive observation or subtle questioning. It would be controlled immersion. She pulled up her calendar and made a call to her operations director, fabricating a reason for an immediate business trip to Boston. It was a plausible cover, one she had used before when scouting for potential acquisitions or evaluating emerging startups. But in truth, the destination mattered less than the journey. She wanted time. Time enclosed within the cabin of that Mercedes-Benz. Time where David could not disappear behind the wheel without conversation. Time where evasion was impossible. David, she said through her office intercom. First thing tomorrow morning. By car. I need you ready for a trip to Boston. We leave. There was the briefest pause before his calm voice answered. Yes, ma'am. I will have the car prepared. As the line went silent, Margaret felt the thrill of the hunt sharpen within her. Answers were close. She could sense it in the tension beneath David's always controlled voice, in the slight delay before his response. The barriers were weakening. That evening, as she packed for the trip, her mind turned over the strange, compelling figure who had sat quietly at the periphery of her life for 2 years. A man who had remained so perfectly invisible until a handful of chance encounters pulled back the veil. But the most surprising realization was not how unusual David was. It was how unusual it felt for Margaret herself to be this consumed by something outside the domain of contracts and quarterly earnings. Somewhere between curiosity and necessity, this had become personal. By the time morning arrived, the skies had cleared, as if the city itself understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Margaret descended to the curb, where David stood. By the open car door as always, his expression composed but guarded. She stepped into the car, fastening her seatbelt. Let's go, she said. David merged into traffic, the city slowly shrinking behind them as they headed northeast toward Boston. Neither spoke for the first stretch of highway. The silence was not uncomfortable, but charged, filled with the weight of things both known and unknown. Margaret glanced at the rearview mirror, catching David's reflection. His face was as still as glass, yet beneath it, she saw it clearly now, tension. Anticipation. He knew what this drive meant. So did she. And this time, she was not letting him hide behind polite evasions or well-crafted silences. The drive toward Boston unfolded beneath a canopy of shifting clouds, the late morning sunlight occasionally piercing through, casting sharp lines of light across the highway. Inside the cabin of the sleek black Mercedes-Benz, the tension was palpable, a heavy, invisible presence that neither driver nor passenger could ignore any longer. Margaret sat composed, her posture rigid, but controlled, legs crossed, her fingers tapping against her knee with a rhythm that betrayed the stillness of her face. David, ever the consummate professional, navigated the highway with mechanical precision. His eyes remained forward, hands steady on the wheel, but even the subtle tension in his jaw betrayed that he was well aware of the scrutiny pressing from the back seat. The silence between them stretched for miles, long enough that the hum of the tires over asphalt and the occasional thump of passing vehicles became an unwelcome metronome of avoidance. But Margaret had not orchestrated this trip for silence. She was not a woman who tolerated unanswered questions, and certainly not when the answers sat within arm's reach. "David," she began, her tone neutral but edged with steel. "It occurs to me that you are either the most underemployed genius I have ever met, or the most elusive." His fingers flexed against the steering wheel for a fraction of a second before settling back into their disciplined grip. "I would not describe myself as either, ma'am," he replied, his voice calm, but lacking its usual effortless composure. "I think we are both past the stage where modesty serves any purpose," Margaret countered, leaning forward slightly. "Mandarin, Arabic, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Hindi. Possibly more. You deflected my questions yesterday. Today, there is no room for that." David sighed quietly, his eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror but never quite meeting hers directly. "You are very persistent," he said, a wry edge ghosting his voice. Margaret's lips curved into something approximating a smile, though it was sharp rather than warm. "Persistence is how I built an empire." A pause. Then David chuckled softly, the sound surprising even himself. "That, I believe." For a moment, the tension seemed to soften, but Margaret pressed on. "What I do not believe is that someone like you exists without a story. Without a reason. You do not end up behind the wheel of a car with that kind of ability by accident." David was silent, his gaze locked on the road ahead. The green highway signs flashed past, counting down the miles to Boston, but the real journey was happening inside the vehicle, between two minds equally stubborn but driven by vastly different forces. Finally, his fingers relaxed on the wheel, and his voice dropped lower. "Long enough, you would let it go," he admitted. "I underestimated you. I thought if I stayed quiet. Everyone does." Margaret replied without a trace of humility. He gave a slow nod, as though acknowledging the truth in her words. "You want the truth? I will give you more of it than I ever intended." "All right," he said at last. Margaret sat back, crossing her arms. "I am listening." David inhaled deeply, as though bracing himself for a blow. "When I was a child, language was the only power I had. Growing up where I did, money, status, connections, none of those were within reach. But words could open doors. Words could end fights. Words could change someone's entire day. I learned that fast." His eyes remained steady on the highway, but his voice took on a cadence that suggested he was no longer speaking just to her, he was speaking to ghosts, to memories long buried but never truly gone. It started with the basics. Spanish at home. English in school. Mandarin from the couple who ran the corner store. Russian from the old man who lived 2 floors below us. Arabic for my best friend's father, who worked nights and taught me phrases when I helped him unload groceries. Italian from the baker on the next block who needed someone to translate when suppliers came by. It was not a classroom. It was life. He continued. There were no textbooks. No teachers. Just repetition. Necessity. Listening to the rhythm of how people breathed when they spoke. How they shaped emotion into sound. Margaret nodded slightly but said nothing, sensing that interrupting now would fracture the fragile momentum he had built. But then, something changed. David said, his voice tightening. When I was 17, I met someone. A man who worked for one of the local outreach centers. He noticed what I could do. One day, he pulled me aside and said, "You know, there are people who get paid for this. Who make a living out of being the bridge between worlds." He introduced me to the idea of interpretation, mediation. Not formal, not at first. It was helping at hospitals, schools, city offices. Translating for families who were one signature away from losing housing. One misunderstood document away from being deported. It was heavy. His knuckles whitened briefly against the steering wheel. Seeing it. The cracks. The people who fall through them. And once you start, you cannot stop. Margaret's expression softened slightly, the sharp angles of her corporate mask shifting as something far more human took its place. For a few years. David continued. That is all I did. I would wake up in the morning and have no idea whether I was going to spend the day translating medical emergencies, helping someone navigate a court hearing, or walking an elderly neighbor through filing taxes. But it was never just the languages. He added after a beat. It was the trust. The understanding. That I could be the difference between someone sinking or staying afloat. And, the burden of knowing that if I got something wrong, if I misunderstood even a single word, someone could lose everything. The weight of his words filled the car, pushing against the windows, settling into the space between them like a third presence neither of them could ignore. So why walk away from that? Margaret asked, her voice quieter now, lacking its earlier sharpness. David's jaw flexed. Because it does not pay. Because it drains you. Because no matter how much you give, it is never enough. And, because my sister. He stopped abruptly, closing his mouth, staring straight ahead. Margaret waited, giving him space. David exhaled, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. My sister died. After years of fighting, after everything I did to try to make things better, to hold things together. I could not save her. I could save strangers. Neighbors. Friends. But not her. Silence swallowed the car, stretching for miles. I did not want to be around it anymore. He finished, voice rough. The hospitals. The courts. The endless reminders. So I left. Took the first job that asked nothing of me but to drive and stay quiet. No one asks questions of the driver. Margaret sat back, digesting it. Her sharp, calculating mind processed not just the story, but the immense, raw truth behind it, the exhaustion, the grief, the quiet dignity of someone who had carried far more than anyone should be asked to. David. She began, but her voice faltered, a rarity for her. He shook his head slightly. You know. It is fine, ma'am. I do not tell you this for sympathy. You asked. Now. The road stretched ahead, endless and open, but within the car, something irrevocable had shifted. The dynamic between them was no longer defined by roles, contracts, or transactions. It was now shaped by something deeper. Something neither of them fully understood yet, but both knew they could not walk away from. The sky above was a vast canvas of shifting clouds, casting fleeting shadows over the asphalt. Ribbons stretching endlessly ahead. The hum of the engine was steady, the rhythm of tires. Against rode an undercurrent to the silence that had fallen between them after David's confession. Margaret sat back, her posture still elegant but far less rigid, her eyes fixed on the world passing outside the tinted window, yet seeing none of it. Her mind replayed every word. Every pause, every glance that had punctuated David's story, weaving it together with everything she thought she knew about the man who, until days ago, was merely her driver. The car moved steadily through rural Massachusetts when the first sign of trouble surfaced. A faint shudder rippled through the chassis, subtle but undeniable. David's brow furrowed. His hands, usually so relaxed on the steering wheel, tightened slightly. Another tremor, this time accompanied by a muted grinding noise beneath the hood. Instinctively, David eased his foot off the accelerator, scanning the dashboard for alerts. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. Her gaze snapped from the window to the rearview mirror, catching the slight change in David's expression, a flicker of controlled concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. David's response was calm but brisk. "Back. It is getting worse. Something with the transmission. I felt it a few miles." Before Margaret could formulate a response, the car gave one final, ominous jolt. The engine light flared red, and the vehicle abruptly lost power, coasting as David steered it carefully onto the gravel shoulder. The Mercedes rolled to a stop beneath a skeletal tree that leaned over the road like an ancient sentinel. "Well," David said, turning the key to shut off the engine. "That is not good." Margaret arched an eyebrow. Understatement of the year. David stepped out immediately, releasing the hood latch, and disappeared around the front of the car. Margaret followed after a few moments, arms crossed against the brisk wind, her heels crunching against the gravel. She stopped beside him as he propped the hood open, revealing a labyrinth of machinery that, to her, was indistinguishable from the schematics of an alien spacecraft. David bent forward, inspecting belts, wires, and fluid lines with the practiced eye of someone who, if not a mechanic by trade, was certainly familiar with the anatomy of his vehicle. After a few minutes, he straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth pulled from the trunk. "Transmission line blew," he announced. "We are not going anywhere without a tow." Margaret glanced up and down the empty stretch of road. No cars in sight. No buildings. Only the whisper of wind through skeletal branches and the distant hum of nothingness. "How long?" she asked, not bothering to conceal her irritation. David pulled his phone from his pocket, glanced at the signal bars, 0. He tilted his head, as if disbelieving, then raised the phone higher, walking in a slow circle. "Still nothing. Dead zone," he muttered. Nearest service area was 20 miles back. Margaret exhaled sharply. Unbelievable. For a moment, the two stood in mutual silence, both calculating, both considering the next move. Then David gestured toward a small sign partially obscured by overgrown weeds about 100 yards down the road. "Saw that on the way in," he said. "Landline. Looked like an old diner or general store. Maybe there's a..." Margaret followed his gaze, squinting. The outline of a faded structure emerged beyond a curve in the road, its sagging roof and battered sign offering no great promise but, at the moment, the only option. "Fine." she said, adjusting her coat against the wind. Let's go. They walked side by side, an unusual sight, the CEO in designer heels and tailored coat, the driver in his immaculate black suit, both navigating the uneven shoulder like mismatched protagonists in a film neither had signed up for. The gravel gave way to dirt, then to cracked pavement leading up to the structure. As they drew closer, the sign became legible, Evelyn's General Store and Cafe, since 1958. The door hung slightly ajar, a bell overhead jingling weakly as David pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint, lingering ghost of coffee brewed long ago. Shelves lined the walls, sparsely populated with canned goods, worn paperback novels, and sundry items that looked as if they had not been touched in years. Behind a battered counter stood an elderly woman, her silver hair tied back in a braid, her face a mosaic of lines etched by decades of sun and wind. "Well now," she said, peering over her glasses. "You folks look like you didn't plan on stopping." David smiled politely. "Could use car trouble. Transmission. We were hoping you might have a phone out back." The woman nodded. "Working phones over in Pine Hollow. But line's been down since the storm last week. Nearest. 'Bout 9 miles that way." She pointed vaguely east. Margaret groaned under her breath. "Perfect. But you're welcome to wait here," the woman added, gesturing toward a booth near the window. "Coffee's still hot." "Well, warm." David nodded. "Appreciate it." The two settled into the booth, Margaret brushing dust off the vinyl seat with a look of distaste, but saying nothing. The tension between them, once masked by the motion of the car, now had nowhere to hide. They were trapped, geographically and conversationally. "You know," Margaret said after a long silence, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the tabletop. "I built an entire career ensuring things like this do not happen." David smirked faintly. "Funny. I built an entire life preparing for when it does." That drew an involuntary chuckle from her, soft but genuine. "I suppose that explains a lot." A pause stretched between them, but this one felt different, not tense, but tentative, like the space between breaths. David glanced out the window, then back at her. "You know, you are the first person in years who has asked me about any of this. Most people do not look twice. Drivers just, background noise. Most people are idiots." Margaret replied dryly. "Beyond themselves. Or at least too self-absorbed to notice anything." He tilted his head, considering her. "Not you, though." She held his gaze. "No. Not me." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement not of roles, but of presence, of substance. Before either could say more, a voice interrupted from the back of the store. A young woman, mid-20s perhaps, hurried inside, her jacket damp from the misting rain that had started falling outside. Her face was flushed with urgency. "Evelyn," she called, speaking rapidly in Hindi. "The delivery truck stuck in the mud on Route 9. They need someone who speaks English to help sort it out." Without hesitation, David rose from the booth and responded in flawless Hindi, his tone calm, directing the girl where to send help and how to explain the situation to the driver. Margaret watched, her arms crossed, no longer surprised but still deeply intrigued. The pattern repeated itself, the instinct to assist, to bridge, to connect, no matter the language, no matter the circumstance. As David returned to the table, she shook her head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "Really do not know how to turn it off, do you?" "You." He smiled softly, but this time, there was no evasion in his eyes. No. I guess I never learned. How? And as the rain picked up outside, drumming against the warped glass, the two sat there, stranded together, but no longer strangers to each other's truths. The rain outside intensified, turning from a gentle patter to a steady cascade that blurred the view beyond the dusty windows of Evelyn's general store. Inside, the air was warmer now, scented faintly with brewed coffee and something sweet baking in the old oven behind the counter. The mismatched hum of an ancient refrigerator and the crackle of a small radio in the corner filled the silence between moments. It was a strange pocket of time, suspended between the rush of the modern world and the timeless hum of forgotten places. Margaret sat in the booth, watching David with a curiosity that had transformed from professional intrigue into something far deeper and less easily defined. His previous confessions had stripped away the image of the quiet driver she thought she knew. What remained was a man layered with complexities, contradictions, and a history that refused to be simplified. The young woman who had entered earlier returned to the counter, speaking hurriedly in Italian. Now to Evelyn, who responded with a mix of English and halting Italian. From her tone and the frantic gesturing, it was clear she was relaying another issue, something about an elderly couple stranded nearby, unable to communicate with the local authorities trying to assist them. Before Evelyn could even glance toward him, David was already on his feet. His voice shifted seamlessly into Italian, calm and reassuring, cutting through the confusion with precise instructions. He clarified the couple's location, reassured them that assistance was on the way, and coordinated with the young woman, who visibly relaxed as soon as he took over. Margaret's eyes followed him, her lips parting slightly in awe. No hesitation. No pause to think or translate mentally. He spoke as though it were his native tongue, his body language shifting subtly to match the cadence and cultural tone of the conversation. He did not merely speak languages, he inhabited them. As David returned to the booth, shaking off the tension of the exchange as if it were nothing more than dust on his sleeves, Margaret let out a slow breath. It is not just knowing the words, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. It is knowing how people breathe in those words. David sat down, offering a small, acknowledging nod. Exactly. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the roof. Then Margaret leaned forward, folding her hands on the table, her expression unreadable but intent. You said something before. That even with everything you did, it was never enough. That the system, the cracks, they swallow people. David's gaze flicked toward her, cautious. Yes. And yet. She continued, her voice gaining momentum. Here you are. Still doing it. Helping. Translating. Bridging gaps. Even when no one asks you to. Even when it hurts. He studied her, searching for the angle, the motive, the inevitable transactional request that usually followed words like these. But what he found instead was something rarer, a kind of thoughtful intensity that was not about extraction but understanding. You never really stopped, did you? She asked, her tone softer now. David exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I told myself I did. I convinced myself that driving was an escape. That it was a way to vanish into the background. But, people do not stop needing. Whether I am wearing a translator badge or a chauffeur's uniform, they are still there. The woman at the curb who cannot explain to a delivery driver where to go. The man in the hospital who does not understand the discharge papers. The child trying to tell a teacher what hurts. His eyes darkened slightly, voice tightening. And when you see it, when you understand what is happening and how easy it is to fix if someone just speaks up. You cannot look away. You cannot pretend you do not hear it. Margaret absorbed that, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest. A sharp contrast to her world of boardrooms, contracts, and profit margins where human need was often an abstraction, filtered through charts and data. You know, she said slowly. Most people in my world, in my position, we think we are solving big problems. Global supply chains. Technology for millions. Efficiency models that make companies faster, leaner, more scalable. She paused, her gaze drifting to the rain-smeared window, wondering if the problems we are solving are the wrong ones. But listening to you, I cannot help. David tilted his head, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You are not wrong. The bell above the door jingled suddenly as a family stumbled inside, soaked from the rain, chattering anxiously in rapid Hindi. The father struggled to communicate with Evelyn, his hands flailing in frustration as he pointed to a wet map, clearly lost and seeking directions. Without missing a beat, David rose again, approaching them. His voice shifted once more, gentle, melodic, full of warmth as he spoke in Hindi. Margaret watched as tension melted from the family's faces. The father's shoulders relaxed, the mother smiled with relief, and even the small child clung less tightly to her mother's coat. David's hands moved as he explained, pointing to the map, mimicking turns and landmarks, even switching briefly into broken English to reinforce key instructions before sliding effortlessly back to Hindi. Within moments, the crisis dissolved into nods of understanding and grateful bows. As he returned to the table, Margaret shook her head, a half-smile forming despite herself. It is like watching someone fix invisible injuries. No one even realizes the damage until it stops hurting. David chuckled softly, sliding back into the booth. That is not a bad way of putting it. The rain began to lighten, the clouds breaking just enough for thin beams of sunlight to pierce through, casting golden slivers across the worn wooden floor. For a moment, the entire world seemed reduced to this small, strange bubble of existence, two people, stranded not just by circumstance, but by the collision of two very different lives. Margaret's phone vibrated suddenly, breaking the spell. A single bar of signal had finally clawed its way back into existence. She glanced at the screen, a message from her assistant, asking if everything was all right. She ignored it. Turning back to David, her voice was steady but carried a new undertone, one that hinted at decisions forming, ideas taking shape. You know, she said, I have spent my entire life building systems. Systems designed to scale, to be efficient, to optimize resources. He raised an eyebrow, sensing a pivot. And maybe, she continued, her eyes locking onto his, what I should have been building are systems that actually matter to people. Systems that do what you do. What you have always done. David studied her, unsure whether to brace for what was coming next or to believe that perhaps, this conversation was not leading toward an offer, a deal, or an extraction, but something else entirely. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the world felt, for just a moment, profoundly still. The drizzle outside faded into a persistent mist, cloaking the landscape in a thin veil that made the world seem quieter, almost suspended in time. Inside Evelyn's general store, the hum of conversation had faded as the stranded families received help, directions, and comfort. For now, everything was still, but between Margaret and David, something deeper was shifting, an unraveling of boundaries neither had expected nor fully understood. Margaret sat with her hands folded on the table, her gaze fixed on David with an intensity that was no longer just curiosity. It was something more layered, more complex. Her mind, trained for years to dissect mergers, acquisitions, and complex financial ecosystems, now turned with equal precision toward the intricate web of a man who had, until recently, been nothing more than an auxiliary figure in the background of her life. David leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, not defensive but contemplative. There was no longer a pretense of silence, no shields of professionalism between them. Only the raw presence of two people confronting a truth neither had anticipated sharing. "You mentioned before," Margaret began, her voice steady but softened, "reasons why you became who you are. Things you do not usually talk about. That there were other." David's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window, his jaw tightening slightly. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence itself spoke volumes, of weight carried, of memories unresolved, of doors long kept closed. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "There is more." Margaret waited. She had learned the patience of a negotiator, but this was not negotiation. This was something closer to reverence, an understanding that the stories people locked away were not open through pressure but presence. "I told you about my sister," David continued, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup absent-mindedly. "What I did not tell you is, she was the reason I started learning languages in the first place. More than just survival. More than just helping neighbors." His eyes darkened, the memory pulling him inward. "She was born with a congenital heart defect. Fragile from the start. My parents, they struggled. Not just financially, but everything. Navigating the medical system when English was not their first language was a nightmare. Doctors spoke fast, used jargon, didn't bother checking if my parents understood. Mistakes happened. Bad ones. Things that could have been prevented if someone had just listened." Explained. His hands clenched slightly on the table. "I was 10 years old when I translated my first medical form. 10. Sitting in a waiting room, flipping words in my head, trying to understand phrases even the adults struggled with. By the time I was 12, I was translating surgical consultations. By 14, I was explaining postoperative care instructions because no one else would." Margaret inhaled sharply, her throat tightening despite herself. She knew hardship intellectually. The grind of breaking into male-dominated industries, the weight of expectation, the merciless pace of Wall Street. But this was hardship of a different kind. Raw. Personal. Unforgiving. David continued, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "And it was not just my family. Word spread. People knew there was this kid who could explain things. Who could speak to the nurse, the clerk, the landlord, the teacher. My apartment became something else. A place where people brought their problems, their papers, their fears. And I would sit at that kitchen table with a pencil, a dictionary, and do my best." His eyes flicked toward her, searching her face not for pity but understanding. "You asked why I speak so many languages. That is why. Because every time someone knocked on our door, it was a new crisis, a new language, a new system designed to confuse them into failure." Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands now loosely folded, her expression softer than it had been in years. And no one stepped in. No social workers. No community outreach. David shook his head, his laugh hollow. "A few tried. But the system, it is built like a maze. Purposefully confusing. Overworked staff. Language barriers. No translators after certain hours. If your appointment's at 8 in the morning, good luck." If it is at 6 in the evening, forget it. You are on your own. He paused, his fingers tightening around the cup. No one else was. I became that bridge. I had to be. Because. Margaret exhaled slowly, absorbing the enormity of it. Her world revolved around efficiency. Optimization, automation. Yet sitting here, she was confronted with a truth no algorithm could solve, that there were entire ecosystems of struggle operating parallel to hers, invisible to the privileged, devastating to the unseen. And your sister? She began carefully. David's eyes softened, though the grief remained sharp. She fought. God, she fought. Every surgery, every setback. She learned English too, of course. But the medical terms, the insurance codes, it was always on me. I was the buffer. The filter. I carried her paperwork as often as I carried her to the ER. His voice grew quieter. She passed when I was 22. After her last surgery failed. And when she was gone, the weight of it, it broke something in me. He leaned back, staring upward, as though the answers might be hidden in the ceiling beams. Walked away. From the hospitals. The clinics. The endless lines of people needing help. I told myself I was done. That I had done my part. That I deserved to fade out. Margaret swallowed hard, the tightness in her chest unfamiliar. Vulnerability was something she encountered only in competitors she crushed, not in herself. But now it rose like an uninvited guest, demanding space. And yet, she said, her voice softer. Here you are. Still helping. David gave her a sidelong glance, his smile faint but real. Work, but the work does not leave you. Yeah. Turns out, you can leave the. A silence followed, but it was no longer tense. It was full. Heavy with understanding, shared not through contracts or negotiations but through the simple, profound act of being witnessed. For a long moment, neither moved. The rain continued its whisper against the glass. Somewhere in the back, Evelyn hummed softly as she wiped down the counter. Life, as always, went on. Then Margaret spoke, her voice different now, not the clipped precision of an executive, but something warmer, slower, as though recalibrating. David. I do not know exactly what this means yet. But what I do know, is that what you have been doing your whole life. That is not just valuable. It is revolutionary. David looked at her, one eyebrow lifting in cautious curiosity. Revolutionary? She nodded, her gaze steady, filled now with the fire of a new idea forming, one that neither of them could yet fully see but that both could feel was inevitable. Yes. And I think, it is time the rest of the world figured that out. The clouds had finally begun to lift, fragments of blue cutting through the gray canopy above. The rain softened into a gentle mist that hovered over the asphalt, clinging to the trees and draping the world in a silver sheen. Inside Evelyn's general store, a different kind of clarity was forming, one not dictated by weather, but by the quiet collision of two vastly different lives now. Irreversibly entangled. Margaret sat in the worn booth, her posture still as statuesque as always but tinged with something different. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of an executive parsing a quarterly report. Or dismantling a negotiation. They held something sharper. Deeper. A precise, calculated urgency fused with a dawning sense of purpose. She was watching David not as a curiosity anymore, but as the spark of something far larger than either of them had yet articulated. David leaned back, arms crossed, studying her with the wary caution of someone who had Spent a lifetime assuming the world only noticed him when it needed something. He recognized that look in her eyes. He had seen it on venture capitalists evaluating startups, on landlords weighing tenants, on lawyers parsing contracts. But this felt different, less extractive, more catalytic. "You are serious," David said after a long silence, his tone not questioning the truth of her statement but the magnitude of it. Margaret nodded, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Completely." "For what exactly?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his gaze narrowing, not out of suspicion, but out of the sharp reflex of someone accustomed to the fine print beneath the promises. She tapped the table lightly, once, twice, organizing her thoughts the same way she organized her boardroom strategies. "You have spent your life being the bridge between worlds. Not just through language, but through understanding. Through presence. You did not just learn how to translate words. You learned how to translate systems. Bureaucracy. Fear. Helplessness. And what I realized," she went on, her voice gaining momentum, "is that this skill, this purpose, it is scalable. Not through apps. Not through AI. But through people. Through training. Through community. You built something without even meaning to, a living, breathing model of what the world should be doing for itself." David tilted his head, thoughtful but skeptical. "Business? You want to turn what I do into, what? She shook her head immediately. "No. Not a business. A movement. A system. A platform that trains cultural liaisons. Real people. Like you. People who live in the gaps, who understand the language, not just spoken language, but the language of systems, fear, survival. People who can navigate hospitals, courts, schools, housing offices. People who are invisible right now, but indispensable." His jaw tightened, his fingers drumming slowly against his bicep. "That sounds noble. But also naive. You have no idea how deep those cracks are. How wide the gaps really get." Her gaze did not waver. "You are right. I do not. But you do. And that is why you are the key." David exhaled sharply, glancing away as though the intensity of the moment required an anchor beyond her piercing focus. His eyes traveled the interior of the store, the sagging shelves, the faded posters, the clock on the wall that ticked just a fraction too slow. All his life, these kinds of places, forgotten, in between spaces, had been his domain. The backdrop to a life lived in service of others' emergencies. "And you think the world is ready for that?" he asked finally, quietly. "I do not care if the world is ready," Margaret replied. "It is necessary. Readiness is irrelevant." He barked a laugh at that, short, surprised. "God. You really are different." She allowed a small smile. "So are you." For a while, the two simply sat there, letting the enormity of the idea settle. No longer just a conversation. No longer just curiosity. It had transformed into the outline of something real, a model neither had drawn before but both could now begin to see. Margaret leaned forward, her voice lowering, as though sharing a secret that had only just revealed itself to her. "I have spent my entire career scaling things that serve the top 1%. Platforms that optimize profits, systems that enhance efficiency for corporations that already have more than they need. What I have never done, is build something that scales empathy. Scales understanding. But sitting here, looking at you, I realize that is possible. David studied her in silence, the weight of her words settling into his bones. For so long, his world had been reactive, responding to crises, solving problems one person at a time. The idea of proactively building something larger, something designed to prevent the suffering before it started, was both intoxicating and terrifying. "You know," he said eventually, "people like me, we are taught not to dream that big. We are taught that the best we can do is survive. Help where we can. Keep our heads down. Blend in." Margaret's eyes did not flinch. "Then maybe it is time someone taught you otherwise." He shook his head, half in disbelief, half in awe. "You really mean it?" "I do." "And you think, what? That we build a network? Train people like me?" "Exactly," she confirmed. "And not just language skills. System fluency. How to navigate the DMV, how to decode medical billing. How to translate legalese into something human. How to guide someone through an eviction notice. A job application. A visa process." His hands rubbed his jaw, processing. "That would be massive." "Yes," she agreed. "It would." He looked at her, truly looked, and in that gaze was the acknowledgement of something rare. The collision of purpose and power. Of lived experience and institutional might. Of someone who knew the streets and someone who knew the skyscrapers, finally meeting not at the crossroads of need and charity, but at the crossroads of partnership. "I would do it," David said finally, his voice steady. "But on one condition." Margaret's eyebrow arched. "Name it." "I do not leave my community behind. Whatever we build, it serves them first. It starts with them." Her response was immediate, fierce. "Of course. That is the point." A long silence followed, but it was the kind of silence that hums with potential, pregnant with the first stirrings of a future neither of them had imagined before stepping into that car this morning. Outside, the clouds began to break, and the first shaft of full sunlight burst through, illuminating the road ahead. For the first time, it felt like the horizon itself had widened. Not just for Margaret. Not just for David. But for every unseen person whose life would one day be shaped by this unlikely partnership, born not from strategy, not from profit, but from the simple, undeniable truth that when people listen, when they translate, when they connect, the world changes. The road shimmered beneath the clearing sky as the sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, painting everything in warm, golden light. The mist began to evaporate, leaving behind the scent of rain-soaked earth and distant pine. The air felt fresher, cleaner, as if even the weather had aligned itself with the new energy brewing between them. Back inside Evelyn's general store, the silence between Margaret and David was no longer tense nor uncertain. It was the dense, electric quiet that comes right after a decision has been made but before the first irreversible step is taken. They both sat back in the booth, staring out the window for a moment as if absorbing the weight of what they had just agreed to in principle. Margaret shifted first, pulling her tablet from her bag. Her fingers danced across the screen. Unlocking encrypted files, opening project templates, blank frameworks that had built billion-dollar ventures before, and now were about to be repurposed for something entirely different. She turned the screen toward David. "This is where it starts," she said, her voice sharper now, no longer softened by curiosity but honed by determination. "A pilot program. One city. One community. Yours." David leaned forward, scanning the clean, minimalist interface filled with placeholders for budgets, roles, operational plans. His lips pressed into a line, half impressed, half overwhelmed By the machinery of Margaret's world. Where his world was improvisation, hers was orchestration. "And what does this pilot look like?" he asked, his tone cautious but engaged. "We begin with a community hub." She answered without hesitation. "Physical space. Somewhere accessible. It is not just a language center. It is an empowerment center. Navigators, not just translators. People who can help decode not just English, but the entire bureaucracy, hospitals, courts, housing, employment." David nodded slowly. "Behind the words. It is not just about the words. It is about understanding the systems." "Exactly," Margaret said, her eyes bright with the thrill of the build. "Phrases. You are translating reality. You are not just translating." Her fingers moved again, populating the template. "The budget covers salaries for a core team. Community members who are already doing this work informally. We formalize it. Train them. Pay them what they are worth. Healthcare. Benefits. No more volunteer burnout." David's throat tightened unexpectedly. "You mean, actually treating them like professionals?" "Because they are," she confirmed. "And we build tech around them. Not to replace them, but to support them. Scheduling tools. Resource databases. Live document translation aids. AI assists. Where possible, but never replaces the human bridge." He rubbed his jaw, absorbing it, fighting against the reflex to dismiss it as too good to be true. "And this is just, what? Your next project?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "No. This is not a project. Projects end. This is a division. A permanent arm of my company. A core function." He blinked. "A division." "Yes," she repeated. "Marketing. A cultural navigation division. Just as vital as finance. As operations. As." David exhaled, his fingers tapping the edge of the table, processing. "No one does this." "Well," Margaret replied, meeting his gaze with something fierce. "No one did. Until now." A long silence followed, but it was rich with possibility rather than doubt. David could almost feel the tectonic plates shifting beneath his feet, a lifetime of invisibility being rearranged into something that had shape, form, permanence. Margaret broke the silence. "You are not my driver anymore, David." His eyes snapped to hers, startled but not surprised. "You are my director of cultural navigation," she continued, her tone not offering but declaring. "Effective immediately. Full executive authority over the design, implementation, and management of this program." David sat back, stunned. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again before words finally surfaced. "Margaret, that is. I do not even know what to say." "Say yes," she replied simply. He laughed, breathless, shaking his head. "You are out of your mind." "Completely," she agreed without missing a beat. "But so are you. It is why this will work." His eyes softened, though uncertainty lingered in the furrow of his brow. "I never went to college. I have never worked in an office. I do not have a resume that fits into any box that qualifies me for something like this. And that," Margaret said, her gaze unwavering, "qualified, is precisely why you are the only person." Her voice softened, but her conviction did not waver. "You built this skill set under fire. Under conditions no training program could replicate. You know how to speak to people no one else listens to. You know how the systems are designed to confuse, to frustrate, to exclude. You are not an academic solution. You are the real one. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, rubbing his hands together as though trying to ground himself in the reality of this moment. And you are seriously ready to back this? Fund it? Not fund. She corrected. Invest. Build. Expand. Scale. He shook his head again, this time with a smile tugging at his lips. God. You are terrifying. Only if you are on the wrong side of the deal. She replied, smirking. His laughter broke fully then, rich and real, echoing through the quiet store. For the first time since this conversation began, the weight lifted, not completely, but enough to let something lighter in. Hope, maybe. Or purpose reframed. You are really not going to let me walk away from this, are you? He asked. Margaret's response was instant. Not a chance. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. In. But on my terms. All right. He said finally. I am. Which are, she asked, folding her arms, leaning back. We hire local first. People who have been doing this in the shadows for years. We build for the communities that need it most. Not for PR. Not for shareholders. For real people. Agreed. And he added. This stays grounded. No shiny office towers. No ivory towers of consultants who have never set foot in the neighborhoods they claim to serve. Done. David shook his head, half laughing, half stunned. Thinking this was my life now. You know, a week ago, I was just driving. Margaret's smile softened, not corporate now but entirely human. Knew what mattered. Turns out, we were both wrong. And a week ago, I thought They sat for a moment, letting the enormity of the agreement settle, not as an idea anymore, but as a commitment, real and irreversible. Outside, the mist lifted completely, revealing a sky scrubbed clean by the rain. The horizon stretched out wide and open, and for the first time, both David and Margaret felt as though they were finally looking at it from the right side. Not as a barrier, but as a beginning. The Mercedes-Benz, now repaired thanks to a local mechanic who had appeared like a guardian angel out of the mist, hummed steadily as it carried Margaret and David back toward New York. The sky was clear, painted in streaks of pale orange and violet as the sun began its slow descent. The city skyline was still a distant silhouette, but the mental architecture of their plan had already begun to take shape, solidifying into something concrete with every passing mile. Inside the cabin, the air was filled not with tension but with an urgency born of purpose. Margaret sat in the back seat, tablet on her lap, fingers flying across the screen as she populated spreadsheets, mapped organizational charts, and built the financial models that would support their new venture. David, behind the wheel, no longer felt like the driver but rather a co-pilot in something that transcended both of their former roles. We start with the pilot, Margaret said, her voice steady, laced with the focus of someone who had turned abstract ambition into reality more times than she could count. 3 full-time navigators. Each fluent in multiple languages. Each embedded in the community. Paid as professionals. Fully insured. Full benefits. David nodded, his eyes on the road but his attention fully engaged. It has to be people from within the neighborhood. People who already carry the trust. Who are already the go-to for everyone when something goes wrong. Exactly. She agreed, typing rapidly. We will create a formal recruitment process but filter it through community leaders first. Churches. Cultural centers. Small business owners. They will know who the real connectors are. And training. David added. Not just language. System literacy. Medical terminology. Tenant rights. School enrollment processes. Immigration procedures. We build a curriculum. Margaret's fingers paused mid-type, her gaze lifting as the concept clicked into place. Yes. A formal curriculum. Modules broken into sectors: healthcare, legal, housing, employment, education, role-playing, case studies. Not just translation, but mediation, advocacy. David's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, the adrenaline of realization mixing with the gravity of the mission. And a digital infrastructure to support them. A database of resources. Real-time language assistance for edge cases. Secure document storage for clients who need it. Already sketching that out. Margaret confirmed, spinning the tablet around to show him a rough mock-up. Clients log in through the navigator. Secure. Encrypted. Documents uploaded. Once, accessible whenever needed: leases, medical records, court notices. No more people losing paperwork and starting from scratch every time. David smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. You move fast. Margaret smirked. Fast is the only speed that matters when you are behind. For a few miles, they drove in thoughtful silence, both mentally filling in gaps, testing the edges of their plan, stress testing it the way engineers test a bridge before opening it to traffic. Then David spoke, quieter this time. This is not just a program. It is protection. It is dignity. People have been scraping by, surviving by luck, by favors, by the goodwill of whoever happens to be around. This gives them an institution. A place where the answer isn't no, or I don't know, or that's not my department. Margaret nodded slowly. It becomes a new kind of infrastructure. Exactly. She tapped the screen, highlighting another section. And it grows. The pilot leads to 5 centers. Then 10. Then it scales nationally. The same way food banks, legal aid clinics, and community health centers grew out of necessity. But faster. Because we have the capital. The connections. The experience. David glanced at her in the mirror, his brow lifting. You really mean it? I have never meant anything more. She replied, and for the first time, the full force of sincerity eclipsed even her formidable corporate persona. As the city skyline grew closer, the discussion shifted to logistics. Office space, not some cold glass tower, but ground level, embedded within the heart of the community. Branding, nothing corporate, but something that spoke to belonging, to trust, to familiarity. We do not name it after us. Margaret said firmly. People, not the founders. No initials. No corporate vanity. It is about the. David nodded in approval. Something simple. Something in every language. Exactly. Something that feels like it has always been there, waiting. They toyed with names: bridges, the center, compass, pathways. Each option tested for how it sounded not in English alone but in Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, Russian. Words that transcended borders. As the sun dipped lower, they began mapping the partnership network: clinics, law offices, schools, housing authorities. Everyone who would need to be part of the ecosystem. Margaret pulled contact lists from her network: people in city government, leaders of nonprofits, CEOs of tech firms who owed her favors, old colleagues she could pressure into donating space. Resources, expertise. David added names from his world, the community matriarch who had guided generations. Through the labyrinth of public benefits, the retired teacher who translated for immigrants at the DMV without ever charging a dime, the street vendor who knew everyone, who had solved more disputes with a smile and a conversation than any police officer ever could. For the first time, their two networks, the skyscraper and the sidewalk, merged. Not in conflict, but in harmony. And we document everything, Margaret said. Replicable. The process, the outcomes, the failures. So it is. Because this cannot just be about one city. David agreed. It has to become the standard. They sat with that thought for a long moment, the scope of what they were building dawning fully now. It was not just a program. It was a template for a better society. One where understanding was not a privilege, but a right. Where navigating life was not a luxury afforded only to those who spoke the right language or held the right passport. The car finally crossed into the city limits, the skyline now fully illuminated against the deepening twilight. Lights flickered on in apartment windows, neon signs buzzed to life, and the constant pulse of New York resumed its steady, unrelenting rhythm. David pulled onto Fifth Avenue, slowing as they neared Margaret's building. But neither moved to end the conversation. Neither was ready for this momentum to pause. We start tomorrow, Margaret said, her voice calm but absolute. David smiled, leaning slightly toward the wheel. No. We started the moment that car broke down. A rare laugh escaped her, light and real. Fair point. The car pulled to a stop, but as Margaret gathered her things, she did not move with the routine precision of countless previous mornings. This time, her exit was slower, thoughtful, heavy not with burden but with purpose. As she stepped out, she turned back, meeting David's gaze one last time before the night fully claimed the city. Get some rest, Director Ramirez, she said with a grin. We are about to change the world. And as the door shut behind her, the full weight of that truth settled into both of them, not as a distant hope, but as an imminent reality. Morning broke over Manhattan with a clarity rare even for a city that never truly sleeps. The sky was a crisp canvas of pale blue, streaked with the first hints of sunlight, as if the universe itself had decided that today was meant for something significant. On Fifth Avenue, the flow of taxis, buses, and commuters resumed its usual rhythm, but within one particular building, the glass and steel fortress that housed Margaret Collins' empire, the atmosphere was anything but typical. In the executive boardroom on the 45th floor, a space normally reserved for shareholder meetings and high-stakes negotiations, the air vibrated with anticipation. The long mahogany table was surrounded not by the usual sea of suits and ties, but by a carefully curated mix of community leaders, educators, healthcare administrators, and immigrant advocates. A dozen languages hummed softly in overlapping conversations as people took their seats, each of them invited here not because of their titles but because of the indispensable roles they played in the invisible architecture of their communities. At the head of the table stood David Ramirez. No longer dressed in the tailored anonymity of a chauffeur's uniform, he now wore a suit that was sharp, modern, yet understated, a visual testament to the transformation that had occurred. He glanced at the assembled faces, familiar and unfamiliar, and for a moment, a quiet disbelief flickered in his chest. Not disbelief in the mission, but in the magnitude of how far life had turned in a matter of days. Beside him, Margaret stood like a force of nature wrapped in elegance, her expression blending corporate precision with something warmer, something fiercer. Her presence alone commanded the room, but today, her power was not in dominance, it was in alliance. She opened the meeting with no preamble. You are here because you are the future architects of something this city, and this country, should have built long ago. This is not charity. This is not a side project. This is a fundamental restructuring of how communities survive and thrive within systems that were never designed for them. A wave of agreement rippled through the room. Heads nodded. Eyes sharpened with understanding. David stepped forward, his voice steady, more measured than it had ever been when giving directions from behind the wheel. This begins with acknowledging a simple truth: language is survival. But it is more than just words. It is the ability to navigate healthcare, legal systems, housing, education, all of it. Too many people are left behind, not because they are incapable, but because the systems are incapable of reaching them. He gestured to a large screen that now illuminated with the project's name, its logo designed to be understood in any language: Bridgepoint. A single word that spoke of connection, of crossing divides, of finding safe passage from confusion to clarity. David continued. This is not just about translation. It is about cultural navigation. About ensuring that no one walks into a hospital, a courtroom, or a government office without an advocate who speaks both their language and the language of the system. Margaret clicked her remote, cycling through slides that outlined the infrastructure. Our first hub opens in 4 weeks. Located in the heart of Jackson Heights, a neighborhood where over 100 languages are spoken within a few square miles. The hub will operate with 6 full-time navigators, each fluent in multiple languages and trained in system navigation. Medical, legal, educational, housing, employment, nothing is off limits. The slide shifted, revealing the training curriculum. Navigators will receive certification in system navigation, backed by partnerships with the city's health department, legal aid societies, and educational institutions. They will be paid at rates equivalent to mid-level corporate consultants, because their expertise is that valuable. A woman seated near the center, a longtime community organizer, raised her hand. After Jackson Heights. And Margaret smiled, a rare softness blending with her usual precision. Harlem. Sunset Park. The Bronx. Then Los Angeles. Chicago. Houston. Wherever the need is greatest. This model is designed to scale. But it only scales if the community leads it. David added. This is not top-down. This is sideways, bottom-up, inside-out. We hire from within. We listen before we design. This is not a corporate transplant. It is a community-led structure supported by corporate infrastructure. The energy in the room shifted palpably. Excitement mingled with relief. For so long, these leaders had fought in isolation, underfunded, unsupported, unheard. Now, they were not just being heard. They were being given the keys to rebuild the foundation. By noon, they broke for a working lunch. As David stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city, he took a deep breath, letting the cool wind hit his face. The skyline stretched before him, vast and relentless. But for the first time, it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like an open field. Margaret joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She handed him one without ceremony. Happening, she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It is. It really is. He agreed, still marveling at the surreal nature of it. She turned, leaning against the railing. You know, all these years I thought success was about numbers. About growth. Scale. Market share. Her smile was softer now, almost self-reflective. But I have never felt more like a success than I do standing here, knowing we are building something that actually matters. David looked at her, truly looked, not as the intimidating CEO who had once been an untouchable figure in his peripheral world, but as someone who had chosen to cross the divide. Someone who had chosen to see. And I never thought someone like me would be allowed to lead something like this. He admitted quietly. But here we are. Margaret tapped her cup against his. Here we are. The weeks that followed moved fast, a whirlwind of construction, hiring, training, and endless community meetings. The ribbon cutting for the first Bridgepoint hub was attended by city officials, community leaders, and residents who showed up not out of curiosity, but out of deep, desperate need. The line stretched down the block, people seeking help with medical bills, eviction notices, school enrollments, job applications. Inside, the navigators, most of whom had once been the invisible translators of their neighborhoods, now wore badges not of authority, but of trust. They worked seamlessly, moving between languages and systems, between the world of bureaucracy and the world of lived experience. As Margaret stood at the front during the opening ceremony, delivering a speech that was translated in real time into 6 languages, she realized something profound. For all her years of chasing success, nothing compared to this, to building a system where dignity was no longer a luxury, but a right. David, standing beside her, watched as the first client stepped through the door, an elderly woman carrying a stack of papers she had not understood in years. She was greeted not with confusion, but with a smile. With words she understood. With help. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The real power had never been in the skyscrapers, the boardrooms, or the balance sheets. It had always been in the hands of those who could speak the language of humanity. And neither Margaret nor David would ever be the same again.